Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us online this morning. Just a few announcements before we begin. One of the things that we've been saying all along throughout this pandemic, if there's one thing that has remained consistent, is that we've said this is a fluid situation, that things are changing constantly, and that there's very little ways where we can kind of determine and predict how things are going to play out. And as it is true to that statement, we have actually decided to postpone the reopening of church for a couple more weeks. If you've been watching the news this week, that the cases have been increasing quite steadily, especially here in LA County. And so to ensure everyone's safety and to kind of be a little bit cautious about everyone's protection and health, we've decided to postpone our reopening for a couple more weeks. So we will continue to be here on Zoom and on YouTube for all of your worship needs on Sabbath morning. And so if you have any questions, our website now is more crucial than ever because you will get more up-to-date information there as well. I'm also going to share a link to our Facebook page for you to like and subscribe to any notifications that we might give, because we're also trying to use that as a form of communication with all of you. Once again, if you'd like to support our ministry, you can do it through several ways. You can do it by mailing a check into our post office box, or you can do it through the Adventist giving link. For all that you give, once again, every week, I just want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts, because it is you who sustain our ministry. Your commitment and your stewardship sustain our ministry on a weekly basis. May you have a happy Sabbath. May you have a blessed weekend with your church family and with those that you choose to connect with this weekend. The story of Job is coming to an end. The conversations between he and his friends have kind of dwindled down. His friends no longer have words for Job in his predicament. At the very end here, beginning in chapter 29, there's going to be 3 parts to Job's story coming to the forefront here. He's going to reflect on where his life has been. He's going to reflect on his present. And then he's going to make some final words of his position. Just to recap, I feel like we need to kind of go over where we've been so far with the book of Job. This is kind of what he does in chapter 29. He kind of reflects on where his life has been going so far. He reflects on the good times, as he says it. On the times where he was full of prosperity, where he had his family surrounding him, where he had people to serve him, possession, land, all that one could hope for. He was surrounded by all of it, and he's kind of remembering this place in his life. He says, I long for the years gone by when God took care of me, when he lit up the way before me, and when I walked safely through the darkness, when I was in my prime. God's friendship was felt in my home. The Almighty was still with me. And my children were around me. My steps were awash in cream, and the rocks gushed olive oil for me. In verse 14, he says, everything I did was honest. Righteousness covered me like a robe, and I wore justice like a turban. I served as eyes for the blind and feet for the lame. It was a father to the poor. I was a father to the poor, he says, and assisted strangers who needed help. I broke the jaws of godless oppressors and plucked their victims from their teeth. Everyone listened to my advice. They were silent as they waited for me to speak. And after I spoke, they had nothing to add, for my counsel satisfied them. They longed for me to speak as people long for rain. They drank my words like a refreshing spring. When they were discouraged, I smiled at them. My look of approval, I was precious to them. Like a chief, I told them what to do. I lived like a king among his troops and comforted those who mourned. Job here is recounting his life. There's this life that's been full now of courage, of tragedy, debate, anger, protest, and lament. And all of this began with a divine wager about human motivation for worship. That's where the story all began, right? The story began because Satan came into the presence of God accusing Job of having faith in God, not because he believed in God, because he wanted a relationship with God, not because he wanted to feel that intimacy with God, but because God had blessed them in innumerable ways. Satan was saying, it's because of all of these things that Job praises you. You've blessed him. And it's because of all of this that Job is here. That's the divine wager. That was the question at the very beginning. Can we have disinterested faith in God? Can we today have disinterested faith in God? Do we believe because we want that relationship, that intimacy, that friendship with God? Or do we believe because we want the fruits of what that relationship might bring? It's a question and it's a challenge for all of us. And now here at the end of Job's debate with his friends, this painstaking search for an answer, it has evolved from a question about faith and disinterested religion to now, is God just? Are the ways of God full of justice? Is God fair? Does God actually love those whom he calls his own? In chapter 30, Job moves on to speak of his anguish, this anguish that has moved him into this place of contemplation, reflection, and now at the edge of rebellion. For he says, I am mocked by people younger than I, by young men whose fathers are not worthy to run with my sheepdogs. He says, verse 5, they are driven from human society and people shout at them as if they were thieves. So now they live in frightening ravines. They sound like animals howling among the bushes, huddled together beneath the nettles. They are nameless fools, outcasts from society. And now they mock me with vulgar songs, and they taunt me. They despise me and won't come near me except to spit in my face. For God has cut my bowstring, he has humbled me, so they have thrown off all restraint. These outcasts oppose me to my face. They send me sprawling and lay traps in my path. They block my road and do everything they can do to destroy me. They know I have no one to help me. Verse 18, with a strong hand, God grabs my shirt. He grips me by the collar of my coat. He has thrown me into the mud, and I am nothing more than dust and ashes. I cry to you, O God, but you don't answer. I stand before you, and you don't even look. You have become cruel toward me. You use your power to persecute me. You throw me into the whirlwind and destroy me in the storm. And I know you are sending me to my death, the destination of all who live. Surely no one would turn up against the needy when they cry for help in their trouble. Did I not weep for those in trouble? Was I not deeply grieved for the needy? So I looked for good, but evil came instead. I waited for the light, but darkness fell. My heart is troubled and restless. Days of suffering torment me. I walk in gloom without sunlight. I stand in the public square and cry for help. Instead, I am considered a brother to jackals and a companion to owls. My skin has turned dark, and my bones burn with fever. My harp plays sad music, and my flute accompanies those who weep. Job, in these moments, is kind of reflecting back on his life. He's moved into a mode of self-examination here. In the first place, he's kind of reflecting his values, and he's reflecting on the community that once surrounded him. In so doing, the story here, it prompts us as well. It leads us in this same direction. It leads us to question, what is it in our lives that constitutes a good life? For Job, he outlines it clearly. He remembers the things that he enjoys about his previous life. He remembers being loved by his community. He remembers serving those in need. More than anything, he reflects and he remembers being befriended by God, being a friend of God, having that intimacy with God. For us, we ask and question for ourselves, what is it that constitutes a good life for us today? What is it that in these moments, in moments of suffering and moments of loss, that we reflect on in the past? Moments in our lives that we wish that we could go back to. Memories, places, relationships with people that have long been lost. Decisions that we've made in our life that we're proud of, or decisions in our life that maybe we might be disappointed at or might regret. Here, Job recollects the moments of his life. And in the same way, we also ask ourselves, what is it that life makes, that fills life for us? That makes life worth living for us, that fills our everyday lives with joy? What are those things that at the end of our lives that we can reflect back on? For Job, one of those things was being a friend of God, having that intimacy with God. But now that intimacy, that friendship with God has turned sour. He's realizing that God is no longer a friend of his, but this cruel and abusive God. He is tormented by God. His vision has been expanded, and he sees the plight of the poor. He sees the plight of those who suffer around him. And he's also angered at God because it's those very people that he helped, that community that he helped to build, that has turned their backs on him. And he not only feels the eclipse of God, but he also feels the abandonment of his community. It leads Job to this place of anger, almost resentment, and he's on the edge of rebellion. And this one final time in chapter 31, as he's concluding his words, he tries once again to prove, to display his innocence before God. He needs to get these last and final words out. His rejection of his friend's theology, his rejection of his friend's religion. And in chapter 31, he displays his innocence once more, but with a forceful attitude that almost demands God to answer him. Chapter 31, Job says, "Have I refused to help the poor or crush the hopes of the widows? Have I been stingy with my food and refused to share it with the orphans? And he says, no, from childhood I have cared for orphans like a father, and all my life I have cared for widows. Whenever I saw the homeless without clothes and the needy with nothing to wear, they did not praise me for providing wool clothing to keep them warm. He says, let God weigh me on the scales of justice, for he knows my integrity. If I have strayed from his pathway, or if my heart has lusted for what my eyes have seen, or if I am guilty of any other sin, then let someone else eat the crops I have planted. Let all that I have planted be uprooted. Here, Job is making his final forceful declaration of his innocence by taking this form of an oath of clearance. He's saying, if I've done X, Y, and Z, then let X, Y, and Z happen to me. But by setting this up, again, he's kind of forcing the hand. He's trying to force the hand of God to declare either his reasoning for the injustice that's befallen Job. At the heart of Job's experience is his innocence, his undeserving nature of what has befallen him. And the question for Job is, I don't understand why all this pain and suffering not only befalls me, but those who are poor and oppressed. He says, I don't get it. I don't understand why. He says, my innocence doesn't quite make sense of these things. And it's on that notion of innocence that I here want to bring up a final story, a section of a novel that I think has illustrated how the depth of Job's questioning here. It's the book The Brothers Karamazov, written by Dostoevsky, with the setting of Russia. And in this section that I want to read to you, it's this conversation between two brothers. One, this intelligent, cunning brother named Ivan, who rejects God on the notion of moral ineptitude. And he's speaking with his brother Alyosha, who has given his life to Christianity and whose mission it is to share the love of God. But Ivan, the brother, he says he wants to reject God on the case of innocent children. And he goes on to tell two stories of the innocence of children. He begins by sharing this story of a little girl, a child, who would not wake up in the middle of the night to say that she needed to go to the bathroom. So she would wet her bed. And the parents, they would beat her and flog her, and they kicked her, not knowing why themselves, until her whole body was nothing but bruises. Finally, they attained the height of finesse, Ivan says. One day in the freezing cold, they locked her all night in the outhouse because she wouldn't ask to get up and go in the middle of the night. For that, they smeared her face with excrement and made her eat the excrement. And it was her mother who made her. And this mother could sleep while her poor little child was moaning all night in that vile place. Can you understand that a small creature who cannot even comprehend what is being done to her in a vile place, in the dark and the cold, beats herself on her strained little chest with her tiny fists, and she weeps with her anguished, gentle, meek tears for dear God to protect her? Can you understand such nonsense, my friend and my brother? My godly and humble novice, can you understand why this nonsense is needed and created? Without it, they say, man could not even have lived on earth, for he would not have known good and evil. Who wants to know this damned good and evil at such a price? The whole world of knowledge is not worth the tears of that little child. To dear God, I'm not talking about the suffering of grown-ups. They ate the apple, and to hell with them. Let the devil take them all. But the little ones, he says, the innocent of the little ones. Ivan says it's one of the absurdities of the earth, one of the world's absurdities of religion. He says, is it possible that I've suffered so that I, together with my evil deeds and sufferings, should be manure for someone's future harmony? I want to see with my own eyes the hind lie down with the lion, and the murdered man rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly finds out what it was all for. All religions in the world are based on this desire, and I am a believer. But then there are the children, Ivan says. And what am I going to do with them? Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony with their suffering, pray, tell me what have children got to do with that. I understand solidarity and sin among men, solidarity and retribution I also understand, but what solidarity and sin do little children have? He says, it's the children, he says, it's the suffering of children that he can't quite comprehend. He says if there's this higher harmony that we're all hoping for, if there's this higher harmony that we're all striving for, this heaven that all religions, he says, are based off of, this desire that there will be one day a harmony and completion. He says, that's all fine and great, and I would be there with you. But he says, but what about the suffering of the innocent? He says, I do not want to cry out with them while there's still time. He says, I hasten to defend myself against it, and therefore I absolutely renounce all higher harmony. He says, I renounce it. I want no part of it. He says, it is not worth one little tear of even that one tormented child who beat her chest with her little fists and prayed to dear God in a stinking outhouse with her unredeemed tears. Not worth it, he says, because her tears remain unredeemed. He says, what do I care if they are avenged? What do I care if the tormentors are in hell? What can hell set right here if these ones have already been tormented? And where is the harmony if there is hell? I want to forgive and I want to embrace. I don't want more suffering. And if the suffering of children goes to make up the sum of suffering needed to buy truth, then I assert beforehand that the whole of truth is not worth such a price. Is there in the whole world a being who could and would have the right to forgive? They have put too high a price on harmony. We cannot afford to pay so much for admission, and therefore I hasten to return my ticket. It is my duty, if only as an honest man, to return it as far ahead of time as possible, which is what I am doing. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I just most respectfully return him the ticket. That is rebellion, Alyosha said softly. He says, no, I would not agree. He says, Ivan, he says it's not worth it. God is not worth it. This higher harmony is not worth it. The justice of God is not worth the price. The suffering of the innocent. The weight of these questions bear down hard on people like Ivan and people like Job. Where Ivan returns his ticket, he said, even if I had entrance into heaven, even if that was offered to me, he said, it would not be worth it. I am morally obliged to reject that notion, he says. Ivan rejects it off the hand. But Job, what's unique about Job in this time and in this moment is that he continues to wrestle. And he demands an answer from God. He will not stop with his own questioning. He will not stop by just being fine with his response of his friends. He wants God's reflection. He wants God's answer to this thing. We see a moment of Job's maturity in his development where he's asking for a judge, he's asking for a witness, and finally here at the end, he's asking for a liberator. He doesn't know how to quite make sense of his experience just yet. His friend's theology didn't make sense, but he knows that God is both liberator and judge, and he wants God to he's demanding that God answer for all of these things. It's a demand that might make us uncomfortable. But I think it's only faith that dares to shout to God so loudly and accuse God so boldly that is worth living for. Because after all, it's only those who are faithful, it's only those who believe, who buy into the story of God. It's only those who have this feeling of an understanding of faith that can actually feel forsaken by God. Throughout Job's questioning, throughout Job's torment, his faith in God leads him still to lean in to God as both judge and liberator. He says, God, I need you, and I can't quite make sense of how you are acting as both judge and tormentor of my life, but I also know that you are also the liberator of my life. And it's in that space in between, in that tension of Job, that we find ourselves here this morning. I typically want to end always on notes of hope or on a high note. But this morning I can only end with a charge. A charge for us that says, will we be committed like Job's life, his experience demonstrates? Are we willing to wrestle with God in the questions of our unknowing? Are we humble enough to come before God with our questions? Do we seek God's companionship even in the moments of trial? Do we remember that intimacy that we once had and seek it wholeheartedly in the moments of desperation? Our charge for us this morning is that we take up the example of Job, to take faith seriously, to dive into the depths of people's pain and suffering seriously, consciously, and authentically. That we find fertile ground in that space for a faith to grow, to flourish, despite pain and suffering. Next week, God will speak. God will answer his call for a response. But as always, God's response is going to be surprising to us. The conclusion of this story is surprising in many ways, and it might seem convenient. But this week, I want to leave us in this low place of having to make sense of this innocent suffering, of having to wrestle with that space. Because the book of Job is not going to lead us to a concrete answer like we would like. It's not going to give us a fact, a knowledge, a proverb for us to share, but rather it's going to leave us with a story that emphasizes faith at the center of a man's experience with God. That emphasizes faith as the only thing that sustains him and moves him forward. It's going to emphasize a faith that at the center of it all seeks intimacy and seeks answers, seeks relationship with God, whatever form that might take. May we take Job's commitment, his challenge, and his questioning as an example for us this morning. Amen.